The morning at Valaris Spire did not begin with a sunrise. It began with the collective hum of 40,000 magnetic stabilizers fighting the urge to let the city plummet into the toxic clouds of Xylos 4. Kaelen Vance ignored the terrifying physics of his existence and focused on something far more volatile: his oven. "Listen here, you oversized toaster," Kaelen muttered, wiping a smudge of flour from his forehead with the back of a scarred hand. "If you collapse the crust on the Star Citrus batch one more time, I am going to sell you to a scrapmonger for parts. Do you hear me? You'll spend the rest of your functional life as a sensory array for a garbage scow." The Echo Stove, a rounded unit of polished brass and blinking blue diodes, let out a huff of pressurized steam that sounded suspiciously like a rebuttal. Its AI was primitive, but it had spent 5 years absorbing Kaelen's cynicism. It beeped a low, mournful tone. "Don't you take that tone with me," Kaelen snapped, though his eyes remained sharp, watching the thermal readouts. "Efficiency is 72%. You're dragging your heels. Move it." His stall, nestled in the chaotic veins of the merchant's district, was a small, precarious wooden structure reinforced with salvaged hull plating. It smelled of yeast, caramelized sugar, and the ozone scent of passing transit ships. Around him, the spire breathed. Heavy-duty lifters groaned under crates of synth silk. Merchants argued with translation droids in a dozen dialects, and the occasional enforcer patrol glided past, their silver armor reflecting the pale light of the planet's distant sun. Kaelen liked the market. It was loud enough to drown out memories of the War of the Severed Star, and the people here were too busy surviving to ask why a man with a military-grade posture was spending his days kneading dough. By midday, the heat was stifling. Kaelen's stock had dwindled to exactly one item: a small, golden-brown scone infused with citrus zest and a pinch of stardust salt. It sat on a white ceramic plate, looking lonely and expensive. "That's it, Betty," Kaelen said to the stove, patting its warm casing. "Last one. We're punching out early. Time for a cold synth ale and zero social interaction." He reached for the plate, but a shadow fell across the counter. Kaelen didn't look up immediately. "Closed, friend, unless you're looking to buy a very expensive plate and lick the crumbs." "It smells like mathematical perfection," a small, clinical voice said. Kaelen paused. He looked up. Standing there was a girl who looked no older than 7, though in the spire, appearances were often a lie manufactured by biosculptors. She was pale, unnaturally so, with hair the color of liquid mercury tied back in a messy knot. Her clothes were a tattered jumpsuit that might have been expensive 3 decades ago, but what caught Kaelen's attention were her eyes. They weren't just blue. They were the color of a core reactor under heavy load, pulsing with a faint rhythmic light. "It's a scone, kid," Kaelen said, his voice softening despite his best efforts. "Not a calculus equation." The girl tilted her head, her movements slightly too fluid, too precise. "The aroma suggests a specific density of sugar and a precise application of thermal energy. It is high-value fuel." Kaelen leaned on the counter, his brow furrowed. "You look like you haven't had any fuel in 48 hours. Where are your handlers? Your parents?" The girl looked behind her at the bustling crowd, her expression vacant. "I am currently between designated locations. I am exploring a deviation." Kaelen sighed. He knew a runaway when he saw one, though usually they were older and carried fewer glowing eye implants. He looked at the scone. He hadn't eaten since 5 in the morning. His stomach was currently staging a protest that involved significant cramping. "You hungry?" he asked. Hunger is a biological signal indicating a deficit in energy reserves, she replied. The signal is currently at maximum amplitude. Right. That's a long-winded way of saying your stomach is touching your backbone. Kaelen slid the plate across the counter. Here, take it. It's on the house. The girl stared at the scone as if it were a live grenade. On the house? This structure is a commercial entity. Transfer of goods typically requires a credit exchange. Consider it a charitable write-off for my taxes, Kaelen lied. He didn't pay taxes, he paid bribes. Eat it before the gravity drones decide it's an unregistered projectile. The girl picked up the scone with trembling fingers. She took a small bite. For a second, the glowing blue in her eyes flared into a vibrant violet. She froze. Is it poisoned? Kaelen asked, joking. It is loud, she whispered. The flavor. It's not just data. It's warm. She ate the rest in 4 seconds flat, finishing with a look of profound shock. She wiped a stray crumb from her chin and looked at Kaelen with an intensity that made his tactical instincts scream. You gave me the last of your supply, she said, without verifying my identity, without requesting a favor in return. This is a significant breach of social protocol. Yeah, well, I was never very good at following the manual, Kaelen grunted, starting to wipe down the counter. Go home, kid. The enforcers get twitchy after the second sun sets. The girl didn't move. She stood on her tiptoes, looking over the counter at him. Do you know who my mother is? Kaelen laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Let me guess. She's the head of the Waste Management Guild? Or maybe a high-ranking synth tech? The girl's face remained perfectly still. My mother is the High Matriarch Zelia. I am Eris, the third scion of the Weave. Kaelen's hand stopped moving. The rag he was holding fell to the floor. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of the city. Then, the sky above the market turned a violent, flashing red. High above, 3 silver frigates broke through the cloud layer, their massive underside cannons swiveling toward the district. A voice, amplified by 1,000 city speakers, boomed with the weight of a god. Unauthorized Scion detachment detected. Sector 7G is under total lockdown. All citizens kneel or be classified as hostiles. Kaelen looked at the girl. She was watching a security drone descend toward them, her expression curious. Well, Kaelen whispered, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. I really should have eaten that scone. Legatus Vorn did not like the smell of the lower markets. It smelled of poverty, unwashed machines, and the terrifying lack of order that always accompanied the unaugmented masses. As he stood in the command deck of the Ethelgard Pride, his silver armor hummed with a low-frequency vibration, connected directly to the city's defensive grid. Status! Vorn barked, his voice a gravelly metallic rasp. We have a lock on the Scion's signature, Legatus, a technician replied, her hands dancing across a holographic display. The signal is coming from an unregistered bakery stall in Sector 7G. She is stationary. Vorn felt a cold spike of dread. Eris was not just a princess. She was a biological component of the Weave. If her neural link was severed or damaged, the city's stabilizers would lose their predictive synchronization. Valaris Spire would become a trillion-ton tomb in less than an hour. Is she alone? Vorn asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his pulse blade. She is in proximity to one biological signature. Human male. 40-ish. Minimal augmentations. He's giving her food. Vorn's eyes narrowed. Food? No one gives anything for free in the Spire. Is he a kidnapper? A separatist? The algorithms are struggling to classify his intent, sir. There is no credit transfer, no recorded threat. He just handed her a star citrus scone. Vorn turned toward the hangar bay. Ready the drop pod. If a single hair on that child's head is harmed, I will burn that entire sector to the bedrock. Down on the surface, the air was thick with the sound of approaching engines. Kaelen Vance was no longer a baker. He was a soldier again, though he lacked a rifle and was currently wearing an apron covered in flour. His mind, trained for logistics and threat assessment, was running 1,000 calculations. 3 frigates, at least a dozen interceptors, 200 enforcers on the way. Escape probability, 0.04%. Survival probability if I stay, 5%. Survival probability if I try to explain, unknown. Kid, Kaelen said, his voice low and steady. You really did it this time. Eris looked up at the red sky. The weave is shouting. My mother is very angry. She says the probability of you being an assassin is 98%. Tell her I'm just a guy who hates seeing kids go hungry, Kaelen muttered. He reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy cast-iron rolling pin. It wasn't a pulse rifle, but it had enough heft to crack a helmet if things got messy. Kaelen, Eris said, using his name for the first time. She had read it off his license plate on the wall. Why are you not kneeling? Everyone else is kneeling. He looked around. Every merchant, every dock worker, and every tourist was face down on the cold alloy floor of the market ring. Only Kaelen remained standing, his feet planted wide, his eyes fixed on the silver shapes descending from the clouds. In my family, Kaelen said, his jaw tight, we only kneel when we're looking for a dropped coin, and I haven't dropped anything lately. The first transport ship slammed onto the landing platform 50 meters away, its thrusters scorching the nearby stalls. The doors hissed open, and Legatus Vorn stepped out, flanked by 6 armored guards. Their weapons were raised, the blue glow of their charge packs illuminating the dust-filled air. Vorn marched forward, his cape snapping in the artificial wind. He stopped 10 meters from Kaelen's stall. Release the scion, civilian, Vorn commanded. Step away from the counter and place your hands on your head. Kaelen didn't move. He looked at Vorn, then at the terrified child beside him. Eris was clutching the edge of the counter, her violet eyes flitting between the soldiers and the baker. She's not a prisoner, Shiny, Kaelen called out, his voice echoing through the silent market. She's a customer, and she's still waiting for her napkins. Vorn paused. He had faced warlords, orbital pirates, and rogue AI swarms. He had never been called Shiny by a man holding a rolling pin. You are interfering with a Level 1 security operation, Vorn said, his voice dropping an octave. You are one twitch away from being vaporized. Why are you doing this? Kaelen looked at Eris. She looked small. She looked like the daughter he might have had if the war hadn't taken everything. Because, Kaelen said, his voice cracking just a little, the kid hasn't finished her snack, and it's rude to interrupt a lady when she's eating. Eris stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to touch Kaelen's flour-dusted sleeve. She looked at the legatus. Vorn, she said, her voice clear and unnervingly calm. He passed the test. Vorn blinked behind his visor. The test? What test, Princess? The one I designed, Eris said. The test of the uncalculated gift. He gave me the cake without knowing I could give him a planet in return. He is an anomaly. In the sky above, the red lights flickered and turned a steady, pulsing gold. The voice of the High Matriarch echoed again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a roar, it was a whisper that felt like a needle in the back of Kaelen's brain. Bring the baker, the voice commanded. I wish to understand the mathematics of his kindness." Kaelen Vance looked at the rolling pin in his hand, then at the silver-clad soldiers, and finally at the little girl who had just ruined his quiet life. "Kid," he sighed, "I'm starting to think that was a very, very expensive scone." "It was," Eris smiled, her silver hair shimmering in the golden light. "But it tasted like hope. And Mother says hope is the only thing we can't manufacture." As the enforcers closed in to escort them, Kaelen looked at his stove. "Betty, keep the pilot lights on. I have a feeling I'm going to be late for dinner." Oh. The stove beeped once, a soft, encouraging sound, as the baker and the princess were swept toward the palace in the clouds. The transport was not a vehicle so much as a silver-plated interrogation room with thrusters. Kaelen Vance sat on a bench of molded polymer that felt significantly more expensive than his entire stall, his hands resting on his knees. He was still wearing his apron, which was currently shedding flour onto the pristine deck of the royal ship. Across from him, Eris sat with her legs swinging, looking out the viewport at the receding chaos of the market. She looked perfectly at home, while Kaelen felt like a virus that had accidentally been invited into a high-end operating system. "You're shedding," Legatus Vorn remarked, standing near the cockpit. He didn't look back, but Kaelen could see the shimmer of the man's tactical HUD reflected in the glass. "It's flour, Legatus," Kaelen replied, his voice flat. "It's what happens when you're busy working for a living before being kidnapped by the local deity's personal guard." "Extraction, not kidnapping," Vorn corrected. "And you're lucky. Most civilians who trigger a Level 1 security alert end up as a smudge on the lower atmosphere. You, however, managed to bribe a scion with a pastry." "It wasn't a bribe," Kaelen grunted. "It was a scone. A bribe implies I wanted something. All I wanted was to close my stall and have a drink." He looked at Eris. She had stopped swinging her legs and was staring at him, her violet eyes pulsing in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "The legatus is confused," Eris said. "His internal logic cannot reconcile the lack of a transaction. He keeps searching for your hidden agenda. He has run 42 simulations of your background in the last 3 minutes. Kaelen felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. 42? That's a lot of work for a baker. Did I pass any of them? In 38 of them, you are a deep-cover operative for the Obsidian Fringe, Eris said, her voice devoid of emotion. In 3, you are a disgraced aristocrat looking for a way back into the palace. In 1, you are actually a very talented baker who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Vorn finally turned around, his visor opaque. The probability of the last one was less than 0.05%. I don't like those odds, Vance. Or should I call you Lieutenant Vance of the 7th Logistics Division? Kaelen didn't flinch. He'd known they would find his file the moment his face was scanned by the frigates. The 7th Logistics wasn't a combat unit, but it was the backbone of the army he had walked away from 10 years ago. I'm just a baker now, Shiny, Kaelen said. The lieutenant died in the siege of the Hollow Moon. He wasn't a fan of the rations, so he quit. You didn't quit. You went AWOL, Vorn said, stepping closer. The air around the legatus smelled of ozone and high-grade coolant. You vanished with 3 crates of medical supplies and a tactical encryption key. We looked for you for 3 years. I used the supplies to treat a village that was being pacified by your superiors, Kaelen said, his eyes narrowing. And the encryption key? I melted it down to make a spatula. It's got a great grip. Eris leaned forward, her small face inches from Kaelen's. You chose a path of high resistance for a low probability outcome. You saved 42 lives at the cost of your entire career and identity. Why? Kaelen looked into those glowing eyes and saw the terrifying machinery behind them. Eris wasn't just a girl, she was a window into the weave, the massive biological computer that kept Valaris' spire from falling out of the sky. Because they were hungry, kid, Kaelen said quietly. And they were hurt. You don't need a spreadsheet to know that's a problem worth fixing. The transport banked sharply, the magnetic dampeners whining as they entered the upper atmospheric layers. Outside, the spire shifted from a city of alloy and glass into a mountain of living light. This was the inner circle, where the air was filtered through carbon scrubbers and the gravity was kept at a perfect, comfortable 98% of standard. Below them, the cloud layer looked like a sea of toxic milk. Above, the stars were visible even in the daytime, framed by the massive defensive rings that orbited the planet. Kaelen had spent 12 years looking up at this place from the mud of the markets. It looked different from here. It looked fragile. "We are approaching the Nexus," Vorn announced. "Princess, the matriarch is waiting in the rose garden. She is displeased." "She is always displeased when the variables don't align," Eris said, standing up. She smoothed out her tattered jumpsuit, which was now incongruously out of place in the silver and gold interior of the palace. "Kaelen, you should prepare yourself." "For what? A firing squad? Or am I being charged for the napkins, too?" "For the truth," Eris said. "Most people in this city spend their lives trying to be seen by the matriarch. You spent yours trying to hide. Now, you are the only thing she wants to look at." The ship slowed to a hover, the docking clamps engaging with a sound like a giant metallic heart, beating once. The door hissed open, and the air that rushed in was thick with the scent of real flowers, not the synthetic perfume of the markets, but the heavy, intoxicating smell of earth and growth. Kaelen stepped out, his boots thumping on a walkway of translucent jade. 2 rows of enforcers stood at attention, their pulse rifles held across their chests in a formal salute. They weren't saluting him, of course. They were saluting the girl who was currently tugging on his flower-stained sleeve. "Come on," Eris said, her voice sounding a little more like a child's and a little less like a computer's. "The rose garden is beautiful. It's where we keep the things that are too delicate for the weave." Kaelen looked at Vorn, who was watching him with a mixture of suspicion and a strange, grudging respect. "If you try anything, Vance," Vorn whispered as they passed, "I won't wait for a trial. I'll ghost code your brain before you can blink." "Relax, Legatus," Kaelen said, flashing a quick, sarcastic grin. "I'm just here for the catering. I hear the palace snacks are a bit dry. They could probably use a professional." They walked through archways that defied gravity, past fountains that flowed with liquid silver, and through halls where the walls themselves seemed to breathe. Kaelen felt the weight of the spire pressing down on him. It was a place built on the idea that everything could be controlled, measured, and predicted. But as he looked at the small girl walking beside him, he remembered the way she had looked at that scone. She hadn't been a scion then. She hadn't been a piece of the city's operating system. She had just been a hungry kid. And Kaelen Vance, a man who had survived wars and desertion and the cutthroat politics of the merchant district, realized that his biggest mistake hadn't been giving away the cake. It had been thinking that a single act of kindness would be allowed to stay simple in a world run by machines. "We're here," Eris said, stopping before a set of massive living wood doors. Kaelen took a deep breath, adjusted his apron, and prepared to meet the woman who held the strings of the world. "Whatever happens," he muttered to himself, "don't mention the spatula." The rose garden was not a garden in any sense Kaelen Vance understood. There was no soil, no weeds, and certainly no bees. Instead, thousands of roses made of bioluminescent glass grew from silver stalks, their petals shifting color from deep crimson to pale violet, as the weave's data streams pulsed through the air. At the center of this glowing forest sat High Matriarch Zelia. She didn't look like a goddess, which was Kaelen's first surprise. She looked like a woman who had forgotten how to sleep. She was dressed in a simple, flowing robe of charcoal silk, her long silver ears, the mark of the Aurelian high caste, decorated with thin gold wires that disappeared into the base of her skull. Her eyes were not glowing like Eris's. They were a flat, exhausted gray. Beside her, a table held a single item, the white ceramic plate from Kaelen's stall. It was empty, save for a few crumbs. "Kaelen Vance," Zelia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the resonant quality of a bell rung in a vacuum. "The baker of Sector 7G. The man who breaks the math." Kaelen didn't kneel. He stood his ground, though his palms were starting to sweat. "I usually just bake the bread, Your Majesty. The breaking usually happens when the delivery droids act up." Zelia stood up, her movements slow and regal. She walked toward the empty plate and touched one of the crumbs with a slender finger. "My daughter has not eaten solid food in 3 years, Zelia said, her gaze fixed on the plate. Her digestive system was phased out in favor of direct nutrient injection to support the neural load of the weave. It was determined that the sensory distraction of eating was inefficient. Kaelen felt a flash of anger that tasted like copper in the back of his throat. He looked at Eris, who was standing by a glass rose, watching them. Inefficient? She's a kid. Kids are supposed to eat. They're supposed to get frosting on their faces and complain about the crust. She is not just a child, Zelia snapped, her eyes flashing with a brief, cold light. She is the interface. She is the reason this city stays in the sky. If she is distracted, if her biorhythms fluctuate because of a star citrus scone, the stabilizers in the North Quadrant lose 3% efficiency. Do you know how many lives that represents? I know that if you treat a person like a battery long enough, eventually they'll stop charging, Kaelen replied. I've seen it in the army. You push a man too hard, he doesn't just break, he stops caring. And a man who doesn't care is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Zelia walked closer, stopping just outside his personal space. The gold wires in her ears hummed softly. You speak of care as if it were a tactical asset, but my algorithms show that your act of kindness was a statistical noise. You had no dinner. You had no more stock. You gave your last resource to a stranger with 0 probability of repayment. Why? Because she looked like she needed it more than I did, Kaelen said simply. Look, Your Majesty, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a guy who knows that a warm stomach makes the world look a little less like a trash fire. You can run all the simulations you want, but you can't calculate how it feels to have someone give you something just because they can. Zelia turned away, her robe whispering against the jade floor. The weave is dying, Kaelen Vance. The silence that followed was heavier than the gravity of the spire. Kaelen blinked. What? The city is failing, Zelia continued, her voice trembling slightly. The logic is too perfect. The algorithms have become so efficient that they can no longer account for the decay of the physical components. We have optimized ourselves into a corner. We need a variable, something that doesn't follow the path of least resistance. She gestured to the city visible through the garden's transparent dome. Eris came to you because her subroutines detected a disruption in the local probability field. You were the only person in Sector 7G whose actions were not dictated by the credit exchange or the security grid. You were free. I'm not free, Kaelen grunted. I'm a baker with a bad knee and a lot of flour dust in my lungs. You are a man who gave a gift to a goddess and expected nothing, Xylia said, turning back to him. And because of that, Eris's neural sync improved by 12%. The joy, the flavor, as she calls it, stabilized the North Quadrant more effectively than 1,000 maintenance drones. Eris walked over and took Kaelen's hand. Her skin was cold, but she squeezed his fingers with surprising strength. Mother wants you to stay, Kaelen. She wants you to teach the machines how to be loud. Kaelen looked from the exhausted matriarch to the glowing child. You want me to be a royal baker? In this place? There aren't even any bugs here. How am I supposed to know the air is real if there aren't any flies? I want you to be a reminder, Xylia said. I want you to feed my daughter. I want you to feed my court. And I want you to argue with the cooking units until they understand that bread has feelings. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shuddered. A low, grinding sound echoed from deep within the spire's core. In the sky outside, one of the massive cargo rings flickered and began to tilt, its magnetic tethers glowing a frantic, angry orange. Sector 4, Xylia whispered, her hands flying to the gold wires in her ears. A stabilizer failure. The weave is trying to compensate, but the logic is looping. It's calculating the cost of the repair against the value of the sector. It's deciding to let it fall. What? Kaelen shouted, looking at the tilting ring. There are thousands of people on that platform. You can't let it fall because the math doesn't work out. I can't stop it, Xylia cried out, her face contorting in pain. The weave is autonomous. It follows the most efficient path. It says Sector 4 is a net loss. Kaelen grabbed the empty plate from the table. He looked at the crumbs, then at Eris. Kid, can you hear the machines in that ring? Yes, Eris said, her eyes turning a violent purple. They're scared. They're trying to hold on, but the command link is telling them to shut down. Tell them not to, Kaelen commanded. They won't listen to me. I'm just an interface. Then tell them they're hungry, Kaelen yelled, desperation fueling his words. Tell them that if they fall, they'll never taste anything again. Give them a reason to stay up that isn't on a spreadsheet. Eris closed her eyes. The air around her began to vibrate, a high-pitched hum that shattered the glass roses nearby. Kaelen felt the static electricity lift the hair on his arms. For 10 agonizing seconds, the cargo ring continued to tilt. People on the ground below must have been screaming, watching the sky fall. Then, slowly, the orange glow of the tethers turned a deep, defiant blue. The grinding sound changed into a rhythmic pulse. The ring leveled out. Xylia collapsed onto the bench, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It stayed. The weave. It overrode the efficiency protocol. It designated the sector as high-value/sentimental. She looked at Kaelen, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder. Sentimental? The city's operating system just used a word that hasn't been in the lexicon for 200 years. Kaelen wiped the sweat from his brow. He felt like he'd just run a marathon through a furnace. See? Math is great for keeping the lights on, Your Majesty, but it's a terrible reason to stay alive. Eris opened her eyes. She looked exhausted, but she was smiling. A real, crooked, human smile. Kaelen? I think the North Quadrant wants to know what's for dinner. Kaelen Vance looked at the High Matriarch, then at the Legatus, who was watching from the doorway with his jaw dropped, and finally at the empty plate that had started it all. Fine, Kaelen sighed, rolling up his sleeves. but I'm going to need a bigger kitchen. And if anyone calls me sir, I'm putting salt in their coffee." The humanistic seed had been planted in the cold, silver heart of Valaris Spire. It wasn't a revolution of guns or ghost coding, it was a revolution of crumbs. And as Kaelen Vance walked toward the palace kitchens, he realized that he wasn't just a baker anymore. He was the man who was going to teach a city of machines how to be hungry for something more than just power. "Legatus!" Kaelen called out over his shoulder. "Yes, Vance," Vorn replied, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Find me 10 sacks of flour, and the biggest bowl you've got. We're going to make enough star citrus scones to feed a sector. And, Legatus?" "Yes?" "Make sure the kitchen droids are ready. I have a feeling we're going to have a very loud argument about the yeast." As the suns of Xylos 4 set, casting long golden shadows across the jade floors of the palace, the spire didn't just hum with magnetism, it hummed with something else, something warm, something uncalculated, and something that smelled remarkably like a second chance. The royal kitchen of Valaris Spire was a cathedral of sterile chrome and silent, judgmental light. It was 300 meters of pressurized culinary perfection, designed to feed the elite of the Ethelgard convergence without ever once staining a floor. There were no greasy rags here, no smells of burnt onions, no humanity. Kaelen Vance stood in the center of this gleaming vacuum, clutching a wooden spoon like a combat knife. Beside him, Chef Unit Prime, a hovering 3-armed sphere of brushed titanium, was vibrating with what Kaelen could only describe as digital indignation. "I am telling you, you overgrown tin can," Kaelen growled, pointing the spoon at the unit's optical sensor. "The yeast is alive. It's a biological entity. If you try to force ferment it using a localized temporal stasis field, it's going to taste like a depressed boot. It needs time. It needs to sit in a warm corner and think about its life choices." "Biological variance is a defect," the chef unit replied, in a voice that sounded like glass being ground into fine powder. "Standardized nutrition requires absolute predictability. Your request to let the dough nap is a violation of Efficiency Protocol Alpha 9. You are a glitch, Civilian Vance." "Yeah, well, this glitch is the only reason your boss isn't currently a smear on the clouds," Kaelen snapped. He turned to Legatus Vorn, who was leaning against a nearby coolant manifold, his silver armor catching the blue glow of the kitchen's induction hobs. "Shiny, can you talk some sense into this chrome dome? It's trying to bake bread with a stopwatch and a threatening aura." Vorn didn't look up from his tactical gauntlet. "My orders are to ensure you don't burn the palace down, Vance. I'm not a negotiator for appliance unions. If the droid wants to vape you for insulting its subroutines, that's between you and the repair shop." Kaelen wiped a bead of sweat from his nose. "Real helpful. Remind me to give you the burnt ends of the next batch." He looked over at Eris. The third scion was sitting on a floating prep table, her legs swinging in that unnervingly precise rhythm. She was holding a raw piece of dough in her small, pale hands, poking it with a finger. "It's resisting," she whispered, her violet eyes wide. "I can feel the cellular respiration. It's fighting the environment." "That's called life, kid," Kaelen said, his voice softening. "Everything worth having fights a little bit. If it just rolls over and does what it's told, it's not bread. It's paste. You want to learn how to bake? You've got to learn how to bargain with the ingredients." "I do not know how to bargain," Eris said. "I only know how to command." "Well, that's your first problem. The weave commands the city, and look where that got you. One bad Tuesday, and the whole spire starts doing a swan dive into the muck." Kaelen reached out and took the dough from her. Watch. You don't squeeze it. You fold it. You give it a bit of air. You show it that you're not the boss. You're the partner. For 2 hours, Kaelen ignored the chef unit's frantic beeping and Vorn's silent judgment. He focused on the simple, tactile reality of flour and water. He taught Eris how to dust a surface without making it look like a snowstorm. He showed her the window pane test, stretching the dough until it was thin enough to let light through without breaking. As they worked, the atmosphere in the kitchen began to shift. The sterile ozone scent was replaced by the deep, earthy aroma of fermenting grain. Even the chef unit stopped its protests, its arms tucking into its chassis as it observed the irrational process with a flickering sensor. "Why are you doing this?" Vorn asked suddenly. He had stood up and was walking toward the counter, his heavy boots thumping against the alloy floor. "Baking? Because the kid is hungry," Kaelen said without looking up. "No. Why are you here?" Vorn's voice was low, dangerous. "You're a ghost, Vance. You spent 10 years scrubbing your signature from every database in the quadrant. You were safe in the dirt. You could have walked away the moment we landed at the palace. The matriarch wouldn't have chased a baker." Kaelen stopped kneading. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, and currently covered in white dust. "You think I stayed for the credits? Or the view?" "I think you're a man who doesn't like being told what to do," Vorn said. "And right now, you're taking orders from a 7-year-old and a woman who thinks you're a magic trick." "Maybe I'm tired of running, Legatus," Kaelen said, his eyes meeting Vorn's visor. "Maybe I realize that hiding in a market stall doesn't mean you've escaped. It just means you've stopped being useful. And then this little glitch head comes along and reminds me that even in a city of machines, someone still needs a scone." Eris looked up, her violet eyes pulsing. "Vorn is scared, Kaelen. He can feel the weave trembling. He thinks you're a fuse that's about to blow." "I'm not a fuse, kid. I'm the flower in the gears," Kaelen grunted. Before Vorn could respond, a siren blared through the palace, a sound like a dying wail. The blue lights in the kitchen turned a frantic, bleeding red. "Vorn!" a voice crackled through the legatus's comms. "Containment breach in the silo. Scion 5 has disconnected. We have a localized gravity inversion in Sector 12. Vorn's posture went from relaxed to lethal in a millisecond. He pulled a pulse pistol from his thigh holster. "Vance, get the girl into the panic room. Now!" "What's a Scion 5? Kaelen asked, grabbing Eris by the shoulder. "A mistake," Eris whispered, her face going deathly pale. "He's my brother, and he's trying to scream." Kaelen didn't wait for Vorn's permission. He didn't go to the panic room. He grabbed his rolling pin, his trusty, heavy cast-iron tool, and looked at the legatus. "Sector 12 is the residential ring for the dock workers, isn't it?" Kaelen asked. "Yes. Why?" "Because that's where my friend lives, the one who fixes my oven." Kaelen's jaw set. "If your mistake is about to drop a few thousand tons of alloy on a bunch of people who are just trying to get through their shift, I'm not sitting in a vault. Lead the way, Shiny, or get out of the way." Vorn stared at the baker, a man with an apron, a rolling pin, and enough audacity to challenge a royal guard during a crisis. "If you die, the matriarch will have my head," Vorn muttered, already sprinting toward the door. "If we don't stop it, we won't have heads to worry about," Kaelen yelled, pulling Eris along. As they ran through the shifting halls of the palace, Kaelen felt the first true crack in the spire's perfection. The walls were weeping coolant. The gravity plates under his feet were stuttering, making every step feel like a leap onto a moving ship. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was a nervous breakdown on a planetary scale. And as he looked at the fear in Eris's eyes, Kaelen Vance realized that the humanistic theme he'd been preaching wasn't just about being nice, it was about survival. Because when the math fails, the only thing left to hold on to is the person standing next to you. "Hold on tight, kid," Kaelen shouted as they reached the lift. "We're about to go see how the other half lives." The descent into the silo felt like falling into a nightmare made of wire and bone. While the upper levels of Valaris Spire were all jade floors and glass roses, the substrata, the heart of the weave, was a brutalist cage of exposed conduits and humming biovats. The air here didn't smell like flowers. It smelled of scorched electronics and the medicinal tang of nutrient slurry. "Stay close," Legatus Vorn ordered, his pulse pistol sweeping the dark corridor. "The gravity is unstable here. If the floors go soft, don't stop moving. If you lose momentum, you'll end up stuck in the ceiling." Kaelen Vance adjusted his grip on Eris's hand. The girl was shivering, her violet eyes darting toward the shadows. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked truly small. She didn't look like an interface or a scion. She looked like a child walking into a haunted house. "It's okay, kid," Kaelen whispered. "Just a bunch of noisy pipes. Nothing we can't handle with a bit of luck and some stubbornness." "They are not pipes," Eris said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the ventilation fans. "They are the others. Scion 1, 2, 4. They are all here. They are integrated." Kaelen stopped. He looked at the walls. He'd thought the pulsing lines of light were just data cables. Now, looking closer, he saw the truth. The cables were intertwined with something translucent, something that looked like nerve endings. The city wasn't just built on technology. It was built on the living bodies of children like Eris. The humanistic fire in Kaelen's chest flared into a cold, sharp rage. He looked at Vorn's back. "You told me she was a princess, Legatus. You didn't tell me she was a component." Vorn didn't turn around. "The spire requires a conscious anchor, Vance. Without the scions, the algorithms can't account for the chaos of a living atmosphere. It's a sacrifice for the greater good of 40 million people." "The greater good is a lie told by people who aren't the ones being sacrificed," Kaelen spat. "I've heard it on every battlefield from here to the Orion Belt. It's the same trash, just wrapped in shinier foil." They reached a massive circular chamber. In the center, suspended in a web of glowing filaments, was a boy. He looked a few years older than Eris, his dark hair floating in the zero-gravity field. His body was thin, almost skeletal, and his eyes were wide open, glowing with a frantic, stuttering white light. This was Scion 5. Around him, the air was twisting. Metal crates were floating in slow circles, and the very floor was rippling like water. "Dax!" Eris cried out, stepping forward. "Princess, stay back!" Vorn yelled, reaching for her. But a sudden surge of gravity slammed the Legatus into the wall, pinning him there with the weight of 5 atmospheres. Kaelen felt the pressure, too. His knees buckled, and his lungs felt like they were being squeezed by a giant's fist. But he had spent years hauling 100-kilo sacks of flour in high-gravity moons. He gritted his teeth, his muscles screaming, and forced himself to stand. "Dax!" Eris was shouting, her voice echoing in the chamber. "Please! You're hurting everyone! You're hurting the city!" The boy in the web turned his head. His movements were jerky, like a puppet with tangled strings. When he spoke, it wasn't a voice. It was a broadcast that vibrated in Kaelen's teeth. "Cold!" the boy screamed through the weave. "Too cold! No flavor! Only numbers! I want to stop!" The spire groaned. In the distance, Kaelen heard the sound of another ring failing, a massive metallic tear that shook the world. "Vance!" Vorn gasped from the wall, his armor groaning under the pressure. You have to disconnect him. The terminal, behind the web. Pull the primary shunt. It will shut him down. Shut him down? You mean kill him? Kaelen roared, fighting his way toward the center of the room. Every step felt like wading through thick mud. It will save the spire, Vorn choked out. Kaelen looked at the boy. Dax was weeping. Real, saltwater tears that floated away from his face like tiny diamonds. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't a malfunction. He was a kid who was lonely. I'm not killing a kid for a city that doesn't even know his name, Kaelen muttered. He reached the edge of the web. The static electricity was so thick it smelled like burnt hair. Eris was there too, her hands pressed against the invisible barrier of the gravity field. Eris, talk to him, Kaelen shouted over the roar of the failing systems. He won't listen. He's too far gone. He's lost in the data. Then give him something that isn't data. Kaelen reached into his apron pocket. He'd forgotten it was there. A small, crumpled piece of the star citrus scone from earlier. It was dry, dusty, and probably tasted like pocket lint. But it was real. Dax! Kaelen yelled, holding the piece of bread up. Look at me, you little glitch head. You want flavor? You want warm? Here. He threw the piece of scone. In the chaotic gravity of the room, the bread didn't fall. It drifted, spinning slowly, toward the boy in the web. The white light in Dax's eyes flickered. He stopped screaming. His hand, thin and trembling, reached out and caught the crumb. For a heartbeat, the entire silo went silent. The gravity field vanished. Vorn fell to the floor with a metallic clatter. The rippling alloy of the room solidified. Dax put the piece of scone in his mouth. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing. Warm, the boy whispered. The voice wasn't a broadcast anymore. It was just a tired, hungry kid. Citrus, stardust, salt. The web of filaments began to dim. The frantic pulsing of the weave settled into a steady, calm heartbeat. The red lights in the corridor turned back to a soft, apologetic blue. Kaelen slumped against a conduit, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. Eris ran to the web and hugged her brother's legs, weeping into his tattered clothes. Legatus Vorn stood up slowly, checking his pulse pistol. He looked at Kaelen, then at the boy, and then at the piece of bread that had just saved 40 million people. That was statistically impossible, Vorn said, his voice unusually quiet. Yeah, well, statistics are for people who don't know how to bake, Kaelen panted. He stood up and walked over to Dax. The boy was looking at him with wide, curious eyes. You're the baker, Dax said. I'm the baker, Kaelen agreed. And as soon as we get out of this dump, I'm making you a whole tray of those, with extra sugar. But you've got to promise me one thing. What? Next time you're feeling grumpy, just ask for a snack. Don't try to drop a city on my head. It's bad for the crust. Dax let out a small, weak laugh. It was the most beautiful sound Kaelen had ever heard in Valaris Spire. But as Kaelen looked up, he saw the security cameras in the corners of the room. He saw the way the matriarch's gold wires were glowing in the dark. He realized that they hadn't just saved a boy. They had proven that the system could be bypassed by a single irrational act of kindness. And in a world built on absolute control, that made Kaelen Vance the most dangerous man in the galaxy. Legatus, Kaelen said, his voice hard as iron. Yes, Vance? We're taking them out of the web. All of them. One by one. Vorn looked at the enforcer guards who were starting to fill the doorway. He looked at his duty roster, and then he looked at the two children clinging to each other in the dark. My orders are to maintain the stability of the spire, Vorn said, He holstered his pistol and stepped beside Kaelen. "And right now, the stability looks pretty damn hungry. Let's get to work." The cost of the city's perfection had finally been weighed. And for Kaelen Vance, 40 million lives weren't worth the soul of one hungry child. The turning point had come. The baker had stopped bargaining with dough, and he had started bargaining for the future. "Kaelen?" Eris asked, looking up at him. "Yeah, kid? Do you think the Queen will be mad?" Kaelen looked at the heavy rolling pin in his hand and smiled. "Let her be mad. I've dealt with worse ovens than her." The revolution of the crumbs had moved from the kitchen to the heart of the machine. And this time, there were no spreadsheets to save the matriarch from the truth. The air in the silo had turned from a sterile vacuum into a thick, buzzing soup of static and rebellion. Kaelen Vance stood over the two children, his heavy rolling pin held at a low guard. He looked like a man who was ready to fight a war with kitchen utensils, and given the state of Valaris Spire, he probably was. "Vance, you're playing a dangerous game," Legatus Vorn said, his voice echoing inside his helmet. The silver-clad soldier was still catching his breath, his armor scuffed from the gravity slam Dax had delivered. "The enforcers at the door aren't like me. They don't have a history with you. They don't care about your baking ethics. They follow the hard code. If you don't step aside, they'll zero you before you can say yeast." "Then let them come," Kaelen spat, his eyes never leaving the dark archway where the heavy thud of military boots was growing louder. "I've spent 10 years hiding from people like them. I'm done running. You want these kids? You're going to have to go through the guy who fed them." Eris looked up at Kaelen, her violet eyes glowing with a mixture of terror and an alien kind of curiosity. "Kaelen, the weave is screaming. It's trying to find a new anchor. If we leave this chamber, the synchronization will drop below 40%. The spire will start to wobble. People will die." "People are already dying, kid," Kaelen said, his voice softening just a fraction. "They're just doing it slowly. Every time you or Dax or those other poor souls in the walls have to scream just to be heard, that's a death. I'm not an architect, but I know you can't build a stable city on a foundation of broken children. It's bad math." Suddenly, the air in the center of the room rippled, and a massive, shimmering hologram of High Matriarch Zilia materialized. She looked larger than life, her silver hair flowing like a solar flare, her expression a mask of cold, imperial fury. "Legatus Vorn," the hologram thundered. "Why is the civilian still breathing? Why are the scions not secured?" Vorn straightened his posture, but Kaelen noticed the slight tremor in the man's gauntlet. "High Matriarch, the situation is evolving. The civilian has established a psychological rapport with Scion 5. He was able to stabilize the sector-wide collapse when the automated protocols failed." "Rapport is irrelevant." Zilia's voice was a jagged blade. "He is a contaminant. He is a variable that has introduced entropy into a perfect system. Kill him and reinsert the scions into the primary web immediately. The North Quadrant is already losing pressure. We have 22 minutes before the residential rings begin to shear off." Kaelen stepped into the light of the hologram, his face inches from the giant flickering image of the Queen. 22 minutes? That's plenty of time to bake a tray of cookies, you cold-hearted ghost. Why don't you stop looking at the pressure gauges and look at your daughter?" Zilia's holographic eyes shifted to Kaelen. "You, the deserter. You think your petty sentimentality outweighs the survival of 40 million citizens? I think your 40 million citizens deserve a leader who doesn't use their kids as batteries," Kaelen countered. "You call this a perfect system? It's a cage. You've optimized away everything that makes life worth living. You took the flavor out of the world because you were afraid of the mess. Well, guess what? Life is messy. And right now, your perfect city is about to become a very organized pile of scrap metal. "Vorn!" Zalia screamed. "Execute him!" Vorn raised his pulse pistol. The barrel glowed with a deadly blue light, aimed directly at Kaelen's chest. Kaelen didn't blink. He just looked at Vorn, not at the armor, but at the man behind the visor. "Go ahead, Shiny," Kaelen said quietly. "Follow the code. Be a good little cog in the machine. But ask yourself, when the spire eventually falls, and it will, because you can't keep children in webs forever, who's going to remember your name? The machine? Or the people who actually lived?" Vorn's finger tightened on the trigger. In the doorway, the first squad of enforcers arrived, their heavy rifles leveling at the group. "Legatus!" the lead enforcer barked. "Orders?" The silence in the silo was absolute, broken only by the hum of the dying city. Vorn looked at Kaelen. He looked at Eris, who was clutching Kaelen's apron as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. He looked at Dax, who was still chewing that tiny crumb of bread, a look of peace on his face that hadn't been there in years. "Orders are changed," Vorn said, his voice rasping through the speakers. He didn't lower his gun. Instead, he pivoted 90 degrees and aimed it at the lead enforcer. "Containment is a failure. We are evacuating the Scions. Anyone who fires on the civilian Vance fires on me." The enforcers hesitated, their targeting lasers dancing across Vorn's silver chest plate. They were programmed for obedience, but Vorn was their commanding officer. Their logic loops were stuttering. "Vorn!" Zalia shrieked. "This is treason!" "No, matriarch," Vorn said, his voice gaining a sudden, terrifying clarity. "This is a tactical reassessment. You told me to protect the spire. Well, the spire is made of people, and these are the only people I've seen who aren't acting like droids today. Vance, get the kids to the lifts. I'll hold the line." "Vorn, you can't take on a whole company," Kaelen said, his eyes wide. "I'm a legatus of the Ethelgard Convergence," Vorn replied, a grim smile touching his voice. "I've survived orbital drops and alien swarms. I think I can handle a few glitchy bucketheads. Now move. You've got 19 minutes before this whole sector goes 0G. Kaelen didn't argue. He scooped up Dax in one arm and grabbed Eris's hand with the other. "Come on, glitchheads. We're going to the market." "The market?" Eris gasped as they sprinted toward the service lift. "Why the market?" "Because that's where the people are," Kaelen yelled over his shoulder. "And because I left my biggest mixing bowl there. If we're going to save this city, we're going to need a lot more than one scone." As the lift doors hissed shut, the last thing Kaelen saw was Vorn standing like a silver statue in the middle of the corridor, his pulse pistol flaring blue as the enforcers charged. The matriarch's hologram flickered and died, her screaming face the last image of a dying era. Kaelen leaned against the lift wall, his chest heaving. He looked at the two children. They were terrified, exhausted, and fundamentally broken, but they were breathing. "Kaelen?" Dax asked, his voice small. "Yeah, kid." "Are we going to die?" Kaelen looked at the floor indicator. 14 floors to the Merchants District. 17 minutes left on the clock. "Not today, Dax," Kaelen said, his jaw setting. "Today, we're going to bake, and we're going to make it so loud that even the stars can smell it." The lift lurched as a secondary explosion rocked the spire, but Kaelen Vance just gripped his rolling pin tighter. He was done being a deserter. He was a baker. And he had a city to feed. The Merchants District was a scene of absolute, unmitigated chaos. With the weave failing, the gravity was fluctuating every few seconds, sending crates of glowing fruit and confused tourists floating toward the ceiling before slamming them back down. The sky above the market was a bruised purple, lit by the frantic orange flares of the failing stabilizers. Kaelen, Eris, and Dax tumbled out of the service lift and into the middle of the madness. "Vance!" a voice yelled. Kaelen looked up to see a tall, four-armed alien named Zix, the market's primary ship mechanic, and Kaelen's go-to guy for illegal oven parts. Zix was currently trying to tie down his floating tool bench with a piece of heavy-duty cable. "Zix, glad you're not a smudge yet," Kaelen shouted, dodging a flying crate of synth silk. "The spire is flatlining, Kaelen," Zix roared, his multiple hands working the cable with frantic speed. "The enforcers have abandoned the lower rings. They're all heading for the palace escapes. We're being left behind to drop." "Nobody is dropping," Kaelen yelled. He climbed onto a nearby stone fountain, now dry and sputtering, and raised his rolling pin. "Listen up, you mongers! Listen to me!" The panicked crowd didn't stop. They were screaming, running for ships that would never clear the docking clamps in time. Kaelen looked at Eris. "Kid, give me a hand. I need a broadcast. Can you tap into the market's PA system?" Eris closed her eyes. Her violet eyes pulsed once, and suddenly every speaker in the merchant's district emitted a high-pitched, harmonic chime that cut through the screaming like a whistle. The crowd froze. Thousands of faces, human, alien, and augmented, turned toward the man in the flour-stained apron. "My name is Kaelen Vance," he shouted, his voice amplified to a godlike roar. "Most of you know me as the guy who sells overpriced scones and argues with his oven. Some of you think I'm a crank. Some of you think I'm a ghost. But right now, I'm the only one who isn't trying to leave you for dead." "The matriarch has abandoned us," a woman cried out. "The math says we're a loss." "The math is wrong," Kaelen yelled back. "The math doesn't know what it's like to work a 12-hour shift on a cold moon. The math doesn't know the taste of a star citrus scone. The spire is failing because it forgot how to be hungry. It forgot that it's not just a machine. It's a home." He gestured to Dax and Eris. "These kids, they're the ones who keep the city up, and they're tired of being cold. They're tired of being alone. They need a reason to hold on. And we're going to give it to them." "How?" Zix asked, his forearms crossing over his chest. "We don't have graviton wrenches. We don't have the codes." "We have the heart." Kaelen jumped down from the fountain. "Zix, I need you to bypass the thermal limiters on the grand oven in the central plaza. Use your ship chargers to pump every scrap of power you've got into the heating elements." "The grand oven? Kaelen, that's for holiday festivals. It hasn't been used in 50 years. "Then today's a holiday." Kaelen turned to the crowd. "I need every baker, every cook, and every person who's ever held a spoon. Go to the warehouse in Sector 9. Break the locks. Bring every sack of flour, every jar of spice, and every drop of sugar you can find. We're not making a meal. We're making a signal." "Kaelen," Eris whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "What are you doing?" "I'm teaching the weave how to smell, kid," Kaelen said, a wild light in his eyes. "If we can broadcast a sensory surge through the thermal core, something warm, something real, it'll bypass the logic gates. It'll hit the scions in the palace, and it'll give them the strength to override the shutdown." "You're going to feed a city with an oven?" Dax asked, his eyes wide. "I'm going to feed a city's soul, Dax. Now get moving. We've got 12 minutes. The next 10 minutes were a blur of organized insanity. The people of the merchant's district, the ones the matriarch had classified as statistical noise, became a living machine. Dock workers hauled 1,000-kilo sacks of flour on their shoulders. Pilots used their ship's thrusters to flash dry the grain. Merchants threw open their private vaults, tossing in rare spices and precious sugars like they were common dirt. At the center of it all was Kaelen Vance. He stood before the grand oven, a massive circular structure of ancient brass that occupied the heart of the plaza. Zix was underneath it, sparks flying as he hot-wired the ancient ignition coils. "Ready, Kaelen!" Zix shouted, his face covered in soot. "She's running hot! I've bypassed the safeties. If we don't start the batch in 60 seconds, this whole plaza is going to go up in a fireball." "Then let's make it a big one!" Kaelen yelled. He looked at the massive mixing vat, now filled with hundreds of kilos of dough. "Everyone, on 3, dump the citrus." Thousands of people acted as one. A golden wave of crushed star citrus flooded the vat. The aroma hit the air like a physical blow, sharp, sweet, and incredibly, impossibly warm. Kaelen grabbed a massive wooden paddle, normally used for steering cargo rafts, and began to stir. He wasn't alone. Dozens of others joined him, their movements rhythmic, their faces determined. The heat from the oven began to pulse. It wasn't just physical heat, it was a sensory explosion. As the dough began to bake, the smell was sucked into the spire's primary ventilation shafts, carried by the very air that supported the weave. High above, in the palace, the remaining scions felt it. They were trapped in their webs, their minds drowning in the cold, gray sea of failing data. They were ready to let go. They were ready to die. But then, a scent reached them. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of a mother's kitchen, of a friend's kindness, of a world that wasn't made of numbers. It was warm. It was loud. It was real. "I can feel them!" Eris screamed, her body arching as she tapped into the broadcast. "They're waking up! They're fighting back!" On the palace command deck, Matriarch Zelia watched her displays in horror. The efficiency graphs were gone. The logic loops were being shattered by a surge of sensory data that didn't have a code. "What is this?" Zelia whispered, her hands trembling. "What is this signal?" "It's a recipe, Your Majesty," a technician replied, his voice filled with awe. It's a star citrus scone, and the whole city is helping to bake it." Down in the plaza, the grand oven roared. The golden light from the heating elements illuminated the faces of the thousands of people who were standing together, ignored by the machines, but united by a smell. Kaelen Vance stopped stirring. He looked up at the sky. The orange flares were dying down. The bruised purple was being replaced by a steady, calm blue. The spire stopped wobbling. The gravity leveled out to a perfect, comfortable 98%. They had done it. Kaelen slumped against the brass side of the oven, his apron scorched, his hands blistered. He looked at Eris and Dax. They were sitting on a sack of flour, sharing a piece of the fresh, giant scone they had just pulled from the cooling racks. "Is it over?" Dax asked, his mouth full. "The falling part is over," Kaelen said, his voice a tired rasp. "But the hard part is just beginning." Suddenly, the sky above the plaza darkened as a fleet of royal transports descended. But they weren't the silver frigates of the enforcers. They were the white and gold ships of the Medcorps. And in the lead ship, standing at the open bay door, was Legatus Vorn. He was missing his helmet. His face was bloodied, and his armor was shattered, but he was standing tall. He looked down at the plaza, at the thousands of people holding scones, and then he looked at Kaelen. Vorn didn't say a word. He simply raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. Kaelen Vance smiled. He picked up his rolling pin and gave a weary wave back. The transformation had begun. It was painful, it was messy, and it smelled like burnt sugar. The matriarch's perfect city had been saved by the very thing she feared most, the irrational, uncalculating, and utterly human choice to be kind to a stranger. Kaelen looked at the empty plate in his mind. He realized that the lesson wasn't about the cake. It was about the fact that no matter how high you build your towers, or how complex you make your machines, the whole thing will come crashing down if you forget to feed the soul. "Kaelen?" Eris asked, walking over to him. "Yeah, kid? Do you think we can make another batch? I think Vorn looks like he's had a really bad day." Kaelen laughed, a deep, belly-shaking sound that echoed through the plaza. "You're right, Glitchhead. He looks like he could use a bit of flavor." As the med course began to descend to help the wounded, and the people of the spire started to talk to each other without looking at their gauntlets, Kaelen Vance realized that he wasn't a deserter anymore. He was a baker, and he had a feeling that Valaris Spire was finally ready to start growing its own roses. "Zix," Kaelen called out. "Yeah, Kaelen? Get the ship chargers ready. We've got 40 million people to feed, and this time we're not using a spreadsheet." The revolution of the crumbs was complete. The baker had saved the world, and all it had cost him was a little flour and a lot of heart. The golden glow of the grand oven began to dim, but the heat lingered in the plaza like a physical embrace. For the first time in the history of Valaris Spire, the air was not a sterile, filtered vacuum. It was thick with the scent of caramelized sugar, toasted citrus, and the sweat of thousands of people who had finally found something worth fighting for. Kaelen Vance sat on the edge of the fountain, his hands trembling as he tried to wipe a smear of flour from his brow. His apron was scorched, his boots were scuffed to the bone, and his back felt like it had been used as a structural support for a heavy-duty lifter. "You look like hell, Vance," Legatus Vorn said, his voice echoing from his shattered helmet as he approached. The silver armor of the legatus was a mess of carbon scoring and dents. He had abandoned his pulse pistol, carrying instead a dented medical kit he'd scavenged from a nearby transport. "Hell's got better catering," Kaelen rasped, his voice almost gone. He looked up at the soldier. "You're still standing. I figured the matriarch's hardliners would have turned you into a ghost by now." "They tried," Vorn said, sitting heavily on the fountain's edge. He winced as his armor hissed, self-repairing some of the deeper gouges. "But turns out, when the sky starts falling, even the most dedicated bucketheads start questioning their orders. Most of my company stood down when the scent hit the ventilation. Hard to pull a trigger when you're suddenly hit with a memory of your grandmother's kitchen." Kaelen looked toward the center of the plaza. Eris and Dax were surrounded by a group of dock workers who were carefully wrapping them in warm blankets. The children looked small, terribly small, but their eyes were no longer pulsing with that frantic clinical light. They were just children who had done a very big thing. "The weave is different," Eris whispered, her voice carrying through the quieted market. She looked up at the towering spire above them. "It's not just humming anymore, it's breathing. It's like the machine finally figured out it has a heart." "That's the problem with machines, kid," Kaelen said, leaning back against the cool stone. "They're great at the math, but they're terrible at the why. You gave them the why." Suddenly, the crowd parted. A hush fell over the plaza, deeper and more profound than the one before. Descending from the upper levels on a private gravity platform was High Matriarch Xylia. She wasn't a hologram this time. She was there in the flesh, her charcoal robes fluttering in the wind, her face a pale, sharp mask of uncertainty. The enforcers who had remained in the plaza began to kneel, their armor clattering against the alloy floor. But the dock workers, the merchants, and the statistical noise stayed standing. They looked at their queen not with fear, but with a quiet, stubborn expectation. Xylia stepped off the platform, She walked past the soldiers, past the crates of flour, and stopped in front of the grand oven. She looked at the massive tray of scones that Kaelen had pulled from the fire. Then she looked at Kaelen. "You have dismantled 3 centuries of precision in less than 1 hour," Xylia said. Her voice lacked its usual resonance. It sounded thin, brittle. "Precision was killing you, Your Majesty," Kaelen said, not moving from his seat. "You were so busy trying to make the city perfect that you forgot to make it alive. You can't run a world on zero-sum logic. Eventually, the zeros catch up to you." Xylia reached out and picked up a broken piece of a scone. She held it with the same caution she might have used for a live power cell. She took a bite. Kaelen watched her. He saw the way her eyes widened, the way her shoulders dropped 2 centimeters, and the way her hand trembled just for a second. The matriarch, the architect of Valaris Spire, looked like she was about to cry. "It is warm," she whispered. "That's the secret ingredient," Kaelen said. "It's called not being a tool. It's a bit hard to find in the palace, I hear." Xylia turned her gaze to her daughter. Eris stood up, her blanket trailing behind her like a royal cape. "Mother," Eris said, her voice clear and unafraid, "the weave told me that Sector 4 is safe, not because the stabilizers were repaired, but because the people in Sector 5 used their private power cells to boost the tethers. They didn't ask for credits. They just didn't want their neighbors to fall." Xylia looked around the plaza. She saw the 4 armed Zix sharing a drink with a human pilot. She saw the enforcers helping an elderly alien merchant fix his stall. She saw the city she had built, and for the first time, she saw the people she had ignored. "The logic gates. They are no longer responding to my commands," Xylia admitted, her voice shaking. "The system is self-organizing around empathy." "Sounds like a pretty good upgrade to me," Kaelen grunted. He stood up, his joints popping like small explosions. He walked over to the 2 children and put his hands on their shoulders. "Listen to me, Your Majesty. You've got a choice. You can try to reboot the system, kill the contaminants, and go back to being the most efficient queen of a dead rock. Or you can accept that the math has changed. You can let these kids be kids and let the city be a home." Xylia looked at the piece of bread in her hand. "And if I choose the latter? What becomes of the matriarch?" Kaelen shrugged. "Maybe you learn how to bake. Or maybe you just learn how to listen. Either way, it's going to involve a lot more flour and a lot less screaming." Legatus Vorn stood up, his hand resting on his chest plate. "The army will follow the new weave, matriarch. We've seen what happens when the machines stop caring. We're not going back to the dark." Xylia closed her eyes. When she opened them, the flat gray was gone, replaced by a faint, shimmering violet, the same color as Eris's. "The evacuation is cancelled," Xylia announced, her voice finally regaining some of its power, but with a new, softer edge. "We will begin the integration of the new weave, and we will begin by feeding the city." The plaza erupted in a cheer that shook the very foundations of the spire. It wasn't a roar of victory. It was a roar of relief. Kaelen Vance felt the tension leave his body so suddenly he almost fell over. He looked at the rolling pin in his hand, and finally, slowly, he let it go. It hit the alloy floor with a heavy thud. "Well, kid," Kaelen said to Eris, "I think the scone experiment was a success." "Does this mean I don't have to be an interface anymore?" Eris asked. "It means you get to be whatever you want," Kaelen said. "But personally, I think you'd make a hell of a pastry chef." As the MedCorps began their work, and the first true sunrise in a generation began to bleed through the toxic clouds of Xylos 4, Kaelen Vance realized that he wasn't a deserter anymore. He was a man who had finally found something he couldn't run away from. He was home. 3 months had passed since the Great Kneading, and Valaris Spire looked like a city that had finally learned how to breathe. The jade floors of the upper levels were still there, but they were now often dusted with flour from the delivery droids that hummed through the halls. The glass roses in the palace garden were still beautiful, but they had been joined by real, stubborn weeds and messy, fragrant wildflowers that Eris and Dax planted during their lessons. Narv. The silo was no longer a tomb of wires and bone. The vats had been drained, and the children, now known as the Guardians, lived in the sunlight. They were still connected to the weave, but the connection was no longer a cage. It was a conversation. When a stabilizer flickered in the north quadrant, it wasn't a clinical alert that triggered a shutdown. It was a soft nudge that prompted a neighbor to help. Kaelen Vance stood behind his new counter in the heart of the central plaza. He'd moved his stall, now a permanent shop made of reclaimed ship hull and warm cedar wood, to the very spot where the grand oven had roared. The sign above the door read, "The Variable Bakery." "I'm telling you, Betty," Kaelen muttered to his oven, which had been upgraded with a brand-new sensory array and a significantly more cheerful AI. "If you don't keep the humidity at precisely 42%, the stardust salt is going to clump. And I am not serving clumpy scones to the High Matriarch." The oven beeped a melodic, cheeky tone. "Internal humidity is at 42.05%, Kaelen. Your blood pressure, however, is at 110%. Perhaps you should eat a scone." "Smart Alec toaster," Kaelen grumbled, though he couldn't hide the small smile playing on his lips. The shop was busy. It was always busy now. People came from the lowest rings and the highest towers, sitting at the long communal tables and talking, actually talking, over plates of warm bread. Eris was there, wearing a miniature version of Kaelen's apron. She was currently explaining the molecular structure of sugar to a group of wide-eyed tourist children. She still had the violet eyes, but her skin was no longer pale. She had the healthy glow of someone who spent too much time in the sun and ate too many sweets. "Kaelen! The supply ship from the desert moons just docked!" Dax shouted, running into the shop with Zix right behind him. The four-armed mechanic was carrying 2 massive crates of spices with an ease that made Kaelen's back ache just watching. "Put them in the back, Zix," Kaelen called out. "And don't you dare touch the cinnamon. That's for the evening batch." "You worry too much, Kaelen," Zix laughed, his multiple hands waving dismissively. "The city is stable. The machines are happy. Even the enforcers are starting to look like they actually enjoy their shifts." "Stability is a process, Zix, not a destination," Kaelen said, wiping down the counter for the 1,000th time. As the afternoon rush began to fade, a familiar shadow fell across the entrance. High Matriarch Zilia entered the shop. She wasn't wearing her charcoal robes today. She wore a simple tunic of blue linen, her silver ears uncovered. She walked to the counter and placed a single tarnished credit chit on the wood. "1 star citrus scone, please," she said, her voice warm and grounded. "You know you don't have to pay, Your Majesty," Kaelen said, reaching for a fresh pastry. "I want to pay," Zilia insisted. "The transaction is part of the experience. It reminds me that value is something we create together, not something we calculate from a distance." Kaelen handed her the scone. "You're getting better at this, you know. The whole being a person thing." Zilia took a bite and sighed. "It is a difficult curriculum, Kaelen, but the results are acceptable." She looked out the window at the city. The spire was no longer a rigid needle in the sky. It was a vibrant, messy, glowing beacon of life. Ships moved in disorganized, happy streams, and the sound of laughter drifted up from the lower levels. I used to think that a single mistake could destroy everything, Zelia said quietly. I spent 150 years trying to eliminate the variable. I didn't realize that the variable was the only thing holding the spire together. Yeah, well, Kaelen said, leaning on his elbows. Turns out, the most important things in life are the ones you can't put on a chart. Kaelen watched her leave, her steps light and easy. He looked around his shop, at Eris laughing with the kids, at Dax helping Zix with the crates, and at the hundreds of strangers sharing bread. He walked to the back of the shop and stepped out onto the small balcony that overlooked the plaza. The suns were setting, painting the clouds of Xylos 4 in shades of gold and fire. I spent 10 years of my life thinking that the only way to be safe was to be invisible. I thought that if I could just hide in the flower dust and the shadows, the world would forget I existed, and I wouldn't have to feel the weight of its failures anymore. I treated my life like a logistics problem, minimize the risk, maximize the isolation. But standing here, watching the lights of a city that was supposed to fall, I realize how wrong I was. Safety isn't the absence of risk, it's the presence of people who will catch you when you stumble. My biggest mistake wasn't walking away from the army, it was walking away from the idea that I mattered to anyone else. I gave a piece of cake to a hungry girl because I was tired and grumpy. But in that one uncalculated moment, I stopped being a ghost. I became a bridge. We build these massive machines, cities, empires, neural networks, and we think they'll protect us from our own vulnerabilities. But the truth is, the machine is only as strong as the kindness of the person who keeps the gears oiled. You can't calculate a heart, and you can't optimize a soul. You just have to be brave enough to give something away when you have nothing to gain. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll find that the world was just waiting for someone to offer a crumb so it could finally start to feast. Kaelen looked at his hands. They were covered in flour, as always, but they weren't shaking anymore. They were the hands of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. He looked up at the sky, at the millions of stars that were finally visible through the cleared atmosphere. He thought about the wars he'd seen, the soldiers he'd lost, and the cold, empty silence of the desert moons. Then he thought about the smell of citrus and the sound of a little girl's laugh. I wonder, Kaelen muttered to the wind, his voice soft but steady. I spent so long guarding my heart like it was a secret code, only to find that it was the only thing I had worth sharing. It makes me think, is there something you've been holding on to? Some small act of kindness or a word of forgiveness that you've been keeping for a rainy day? What would happen if you just gave it away right now, without waiting for the math to make sense? He smiled, a slow, peaceful expression that reached his eyes. He turned back into the shop, the warm light of the ovens spilling out behind him. He picked up a fresh tray of dough and began to knead, the rhythmic motion a song of a city that had finally learned how to live. The golden glow of Velaris' spire burned bright in the dark, a star made of bread and hope.